Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. The galaxy's awakening humans are apex predators in disguise. The vast diplomatic chamber of Velkkar's moon hummed with the quiet murmur of various species. The air was thick with tension, a delicate thread stretched taut between factions that had been at war for over a decade. At the heart of the gathering sat Ambassador Fitzgerald, his expression calm, his movements deliberate. He observed the room with the careful precision of a predator that had long since learned how to mask its instincts beneath the guise of civility. The chamber itself was a marvel of intergalactic architecture. High vaulted ceilings made of polished obsidian, intricate light fixtures casting a soft glow over the conference tables. Representatives from dozens of species filled the space, but the attention of the entire assembly was focused on two opposing sides. The Georgia Tech, towering reptilian warriors with thick plated scales and a reputation for their ruthless military campaigns, occupied one end of the table. At the other, the insectoid Vexi, their sleek chitinous bodies twitching with barely restrained aggression, clicked their mandibles in irritation. Both factions had fought countless battles, leaving entire systems devastated in their wake, and now, after years of diplomatic pressure from the Galactic Union, they had reluctantly agreed to this ceasefire negotiation. The only reason they had tolerated the human delegation's involvement was that humanity, despite its relatively recent entrance onto the galactic stage, had proven itself to be eerily effective in resolving disputes. Fitzgerald had seen this dynamic before. The aliens underestimated humans, they always did. He leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he listened to the opening statements. Supreme Commander Zoka of the Georgia Tech spoke first, his deep rumbling voice laced with contempt. This ceasefire is pointless. The Versi are incapable of honor. They slay our young, ambush our warriors, and then dare to demand peace. His yellow, slit-pupiled eyes, filled with cold fury, locked onto the opposite end of the table. Ambassador Crix Hall of the Vixie responded with a sharp chittering sound before speaking in fluent galactic common. Your kind speaks of honor while committing genocide on the outer colonies. Do not insult us with hypocrisy, reptile. His mandibles clicked in rapid succession, a clear sign of aggression among his species. Fitzgerald exhaled slowly. This was a predictable start, posturing, accusation, insult. He had seen it countless times before. He made no move to interject yet, let them exhaust their venom before attempting to guide the conversation. As the argument escalated, he subtly studied the body language of those in the room. The Gachas sat rigid, their scaled hands resting near their weapons despite the strict no-arms policy of the chamber. Their species thrived on intimidation, on the physicality of dominance. The Very, by contrast, radiated twitching energy, their sharp angular limbs in constant motion. They were fast, relying on speed and swarm tactics in combat. Neither side noticed the way Fitzgerald and his fellow human diplomats sat unmoving, waiting, measuring. The argument surged toward a boiling point. Supreme Commander Zoka slammed a clawed fist onto the table, cracking the polished surface. Enough of this. You expect us to entertain peace when the blood of our kind still stains their claws. Crix Hall let out a high-pitched hiss. You will regret that. That is quite enough, Fitzgerald said, his voice level, firm. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The entire room turned toward him. The human ambassador smiled, but it wasn't an expression of warmth. It was calculated, measured, designed to disarm without revealing weakness. He folded his hands atop the table. You both came here today because, despite the hatred, despite the history, there is something you want. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in this room. He let the word settle. So tell me, what is it that you want? Silence. Zoka's slit-pupiled eyes narrowed. We want our rightful territories returned. We want an end to the raids on our supply routes. Crix Hall's mandibles twitched. We want the massacres to stop. We want guarantees of safety for our colonies. Fitzgerald gave a slow nod, as if contemplating their words carefully. In reality, he had already anticipated these demands. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was control. He exhaled. Both of you want security. Both of you want to ensure the survival of your people. He paused, tilting his head slightly. And yet you both believe the only way to achieve it is through destruction. No one spoke. Fitzgerald leaned forward just slightly. There's an old saying from my world, he continued. A war can only end in three ways: when one side is completely annihilated, when both sides exhaust themselves into ruin, or when they choose to put down their weapons before it's too late. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. You're here because you don't want the first two outcomes. The Georgia Tech general let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders lessening. The wiry diplomat shifted uneasily, glancing at his advisors. For the first time, there was hesitation, a crack in the hostility. Fitzgerald smiled again, just a small, barely perceptible curve of his lips. He had them. But then something shifted. A ripple in the atmosphere, a slight change in posture among the Georgia Tech warriors. Their eyes flickered toward the entrance of the chamber, their muscles tightening. Fitzgerald noticed it instantly. Instinct flared in the back of his mind. He had learned to trust his instincts long ago, and right now they screamed danger. Before anyone could react, the doors to the chamber burst open. A squad of Georgia Tech warriors stormed in, weapons raised. The room exploded into chaos, advisors scrambling, guards drawing weapons despite the protocols. The assassins moved fast, but not fast enough, because the humans had already moved. Fitzgerald's chair scraped back as he stood, his hand already gripping the wrist of the first attacker, twisting it in a fluid, practiced motion. The alien howled as the weapon was torn from his grasp. Another lunged forward, but Fitzgerald sidestepped effortlessly, driving his elbow into the soft spot beneath the warrior's throat. Across the room, the other human diplomats acted with the same precision. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The Vari other alien delegates stood frozen, watching in stunned silence as the humans dismantled the attack in seconds. Not through brute force, not through panic, but through something far more terrifying. And in that moment, as Fitzgerald straightened, as he looked down at the defeated Georgia Tech assassins with an expression of cold assessment, the aliens in the room understood. Humans weren't diplomats because they were weak. They weren't peacekeepers because they lacked the capacity for violence. They were apex predators, and they had simply learned that words were the most effective way to control a battlefield. The chamber still reeked of adrenaline and burnt ozone from the discharged weapons. Broken furniture, shattered data pads, and the lifeless bodies of the would-be assassins littered the polished obsidian floor. A cold silence settled over the room, stretching long enough for unease to creep into the expressions of the alien delegates. Ambassador Fitzgerald exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his uniform as if he had merely concluded an unremarkable business transaction. His sharp blue eyes swept the room, gauging reactions. The Gatch general stood frozen, his broad chest rising and falling with heavy, measured breaths. The Versi diplomat, his mandibles twitching in agitation, stole weary glances at the humans, the horror in his multifaceted eyes unmistakable. Fitzgerald turned his attention, motioning to the nearest security officer, a nervous-looking Avara with shimmering silver skin. Seal the doors. No one leaves until we understand what just happened. His voice was calm, unwavering, a stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. The Avara hesitated before nodding, barking orders into his communicator. The massive entrance doors groaned shut, locking with a mechanical hiss. The diplomatic chamber, once a place of tense but controlled negotiations, now felt like a battlefield. Fitzgerald rolled his shoulders, feeling the dull ache of exertion settle into his muscles. He turned his gaze to Supreme Commander Zoka. "I assumed this wasn't your doing," he said, though his tone made it clear that the Gatek's answer would determine how the humans proceeded. Zoto's slit-pupilled eyes flicked to the fallen assassins, his nostrils flaring. His clawed fingers curled into a fist before relaxing. No. This was not sanctioned by my command. Quixo let out a clicking hiss, stepping forward with barely concealed outrage. Convenient. Your warriors storm into a diplomatic meeting, weapons drawn, and yet you claim ignorance. Zoka snapped his head toward the insectoid, his scaled lips curling in a snarl. Watch your tone, very. I do not answer for cowards who act without orders. Fitzgerald raised a hand. Enough. His voice wasn't loud, but the weight behind it was enough to stop both aliens mid-sentence. Pointing fingers isn't going to get us anywhere. He shifted his stance, his expression unreadable. What will get us somewhere is identifying the real threat. The room fell into an uneasy quiet. Bigsa folded his arms, his compound eyes narrowing. And you believe the real threat is not the GK? Fitzgerald tilted his head slightly. That depends on what we discover. His gaze moved to one of his aides, a young officer standing near the shattered remains of a holographic console. Check the security logs, Fitzgerald instructed. I want to know who authorized those assassins' clearance. The aide gave a curt nod and set to work. Fitzgerald watched him for a brief moment before turning his attention back to the gathered delegates. His sharp features remained composed, but something in his posture had changed, something that the aliens in the room were just beginning to notice. Humans had a way of blending in when they wanted to. They were adaptable, unassuming when necessary. But now, standing amidst the remnants of an attack, surrounded by powerful alien leaders who had just witnessed the terrifying precision with which the humans had defended themselves, Fitzgerald no longer looked like a diplomat. He looked like something else entirely. The Gok warriors, proud and battle-hardened, were the first to recognize it. Zoka studied Fitzgerald with an intensity that had not been there before. The way he held himself, relaxed yet ready. The way his eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with the quiet patience of a predator assessing his surroundings. It was the same way Zoka's own kind studied prey before striking. A slow realization crept into the general's mind. The humans had reacted to the attack with a speed and efficiency that was unnatural. They had not flinched, not hesitated, not even seemed surprised, as if they had expected it, as if they had been ready for it. Zoka's claws tapped against the armrest of his chair, his mind racing through decades of military training. He had always assumed humans were merely good negotiators, strategic perhaps, but nothing beyond that. But now, watching the way Fitzgerald moved, the way his fellow humans maintained their positions with a quiet, disciplined awareness, Zoka saw them differently. And it unsettled him. On the other side of the chamber, Crix Hall experienced a similar unease. The Very were not warriors in the traditional sense, but they were no strangers to violence. They fought in numbers, overwhelming their enemies with sheer force. But the humans had not needed numbers. They had taken down the assassins with a level of precision that Crix Hall had never seen outside of his own species' elite death squads. More disturbing was their lack of reaction afterward. There was no celebration, no posturing, no visible release of adrenaline. They had neutralized a threat and simply returned to business as if the entire encounter had been a minor inconvenience. CCA's mandibles clicked in thought. Something wasn't right. Before he could voice his concerns, the aide at the terminal straightened. "Ambassador," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to see this." Fitzgerald strode to the console, his eyes scanning the security feed. What he saw made his jaw tighten. The assassins had not entered the chamber through brute force. They had been let in by someone inside. Fitzgerald's mind worked quickly. Someone had orchestrated this, someone with knowledge of the peace talks, access to the security clearance systems, and that meant this was not just an assassination attempt. It was something bigger. He turned back to the gathered delegates, his expression was unreadable, but his voice was sharper than before. This attack was an inside job. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the room. Zoka's claws twitched. Crick's mandibles flared. Fitzgerald folded his arms, his gaze sweeping across the assembly. Someone wanted this peace talk to fail, he continued, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. Someone who knew exactly how to push this conflict past the point of no return. He let his words sink in. And then he did something that made every alien in the room tense. He smiled. Not the polite, diplomatic smile he had used earlier. Not the reassuring, carefully measured expression he had worn during negotiations. This smile was different. It was the kind of smile a hunter gave when he realized the prey had made a mistake. A slow, creeping chill settled over the chamber. The aliens had spent years believing humans were diplomats first, strategists second. But now, standing in the aftermath of an attack, watching Fitzgerald and his fellow humans shift into something far more dangerous, they began to understand the truth. Humans weren't negotiators because they lacked the capacity for war. They were negotiators because they understood war better than anyone else. And when pushed, when backed into a corner, when faced with a game of survival, there was no species in the galaxy more dangerous than a human. Fitzgerald watched the room shift. The realization had settled in, deep, cold, and uncomfortable. He could see it in the way the GCH warriors clenched their jaws, their postures stiff with unease. He could hear it in the stuttering chitter of the Versi, their limbs moving with nervous energy. Every alien delegate in the chamber had come here believing they understood what humanity was. Now they were forced to question everything. But Fitzgerald didn't have time to relish the revelation. He had more pressing matters to attend to. The security breach meant one thing: this wasn't over. Whoever had orchestrated the attack had failed in their initial attempt, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try again. And if there was one thing Fitzgerald knew about warfare, it was that the enemy always adapted. He turned to his aide, his voice low and firm. Lock down all external communications. No messages go in or out without my clearance. The aide hesitated only for a fraction of a second before nodding and moving toward the control console. Fitzgerald's order was a direct violation of standard diplomatic protocol, but that no longer mattered. The moment someone had brought weapons into this chamber, protocol had become irrelevant. Zoka stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the broken floor. His voice rumbled with restrained aggression. You assume another attack is coming? Fitzgerald met his gaze, unflinching. I don't assume, Commander. I know. The Viri diplomat let out a clicking noise. You believe the conspirators will strike again? Fitzgerald exhaled slowly. If someone was willing to assassinate key figures in a neutral chamber, they're not going to stop just because their first attempt failed. They'll either try again or escalate. He tilted his head slightly. An escalation means civilian casualties. The words hung heavy in the air. The Galactic Union prided itself on maintaining peace, on ensuring that conflicts never reached the point of indiscriminate slaughter. But the truth was, no war had ever been won through peace talks alone. Fitzgerald knew it, the Georgia Tech knew it, and deep down, even the Versi knew it. The realization sent a ripple of discomfort through the delegates. Zoka's eyes narrowed. And what would you have us do, human? Lock down the entire sector. Declare martial law. Fitzgerald studied him for a long moment before speaking. No. That's exactly what they want. Zoka's claws tapped against the table, his expression dark. Fitzgerald took a step forward, his voice steady. Whoever is behind this wants chaos. If we shut down communications and restrict movement, it will look like the Galactic Union is collapsing under its own weight. It will justify further attacks. It will push both sides to war. He let the words settle before continuing. But if we do nothing, we risk giving them the opportunity to strike again, which means we need to move first. The Virgi diplomat shifted, his compound eyes reflecting the dim light of the chamber. And how do you propose we do that? Fitzgerald allowed himself the briefest of smiles. By doing what humans do best. The room stiffened. The Versi didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. The GCH warriors had already begun to understand. Humans didn't wait for an enemy to strike twice. Fitzgerald turned to his aide. I want a full manifest of every individual who was granted access to the facility in the last 24 hours. Anyone with irregular clearance, anyone whose movements don't match their assignment. I want them flagged. The aide nodded and hurried to the nearest data terminal. Zoka watched Fitzgerald with something that almost resembled curiosity. You intend to find them before they strike again? Fitzgerald met his gaze evenly. I intend to end this before it begins. The chamber remained tense, but no one argued. Even the most skeptical delegates understood the reality of the situation. This was no longer a diplomatic summit. It was a battlefield, and humans had just claimed control of it. Minutes passed in silence as the data came through. Then the aide straightened, his face pale. Ambassador, his voice was tight, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled up the information. Fitzgerald moved to his side, scanning the data. His jaw tightened. The security logs had been altered. Not just tampered with. Rewritten. Someone had gone through and erased key entry points, fabricated clearance details, and rerouted access logs. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to cover their tracks. They were trying to make sure no one ever found them, which meant they were still inside. Fitzgerald's pulse remained steady, but his mind was already calculating the next move. He turned to the assembly. Delegates, the conspirators are here, right now, watching us. The room reacted instantly. Some delegates recoiled, their eyes darting around in sudden paranoia. Others, like Zoka, simply went still, their training taking over. The Gach weren't afraid of a fight. If anything, the realization that the enemy was in the room only seemed to sharpen their focus. Fitzgerald took a slow step forward, his voice controlled. We have two options. We can scatter, make ourselves vulnerable, and hope that security finds them before they act again. His gaze swept the room, locking on to each delegate. Or we can set a trap. Zoka's eyes gleamed with something close to approval. And how do you propose we do that? Fitzgerald's lips curled slightly. We make them think they've already won. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The Versi diplomat's mandibles clicked softly. You intend to bait them? Fitzgerald nodded. We let them believe we're panicking, that we're desperate. We give them the perfect opportunity, one they can't resist. Zoka let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through his chest. And when they take the bait? Fitzgerald's expression darkened. We remind them why humans were never prey. The words sent a chill through the room. The Vieri delegate took an uneasy step back. He had heard stories of human warfare, whispers of ancient battles, of strategies so ruthless that even the most war-hardened species hesitated to face them. He had assumed they were exaggerations, myths. Now, standing in a locked chamber with a human who spoke of traps and deception as if it were second nature, he wasn't so sure. Fitzgerald turned to his aide. Send the message. We're going forward with the peace talks as planned. No security lockdown, no increased defenses. His voice was sharp. And leak it. Make sure whoever is listening knows exactly how vulnerable we are. The aide hesitated. Sir, if we do that. Fitzgerald didn't blink. Then they'll make their move. The aide swallowed hard but obeyed. Within moments, the message was sent. Fitzgerald turned back to the gathered delegates. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held the cold, quiet certainty of someone who had played this game before. We wait. The aliens watched him, some with distrust, others with something bordering on fear. None of them understood it yet, but they would. By the time this was over, every species in that room would understand exactly what humanity was, and none of them would ever forget. Fitzgerald stood at the center of the diplomatic chamber, his posture deceptively relaxed, his gaze carefully observing every movement, every breath, every nervous flicker of an eye. The air in the room had changed. The alien delegates had stopped seeing him as just another negotiator. The humans had shifted from being considered useful diplomats to something far more unsettling, something unpredictable, something dangerous. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was close. The trap had been set. The message had been leaked. Now all that was left was to wait, and waiting was something Fitzgerald had perfected. He had fought in a dozen conflicts before he had ever been assigned to diplomatic service. He had spent years in war zones, learning to listen not just to words, but to the silence between them. He had learned how to read a battlefield before the first shot was fired. This was no different. The assassins were here. He could feel them, somewhere in this room or just beyond its walls. The conspirators were preparing to make their final move. They believed the diplomatic summit was weak, vulnerable. They believed they had forced the Galactic Union into a desperate position. They had made a mistake. Zoka stood near the edge of the chamber, arms crossed over his thick chest, his reptilian eyes flicking between the human and the other delegates. He was a warrior, bred for battle, but Fitzgerald could tell the general was seeing something new, something he had never considered before. The humans had adapted to this situation faster than any other species in the room. They had taken an assassination attempt and turned it into an advantage. Zoka had underestimated them. Most species did. Saul, standing near the opposite end of the room, was visibly restless, his mandibles clicked softly, his insectoid fingers tapping against his arm in a rapid, nervous pattern. He didn't like this. He didn't like being part of something he couldn't fully predict. He had come here expecting a political game, not a war. And yet now it was impossible to ignore the simple, horrifying truth. This was a war, and the humans were winning it.